I was 43 when my world changed forever. My son, Daniel, was 18 at the time. Bright, full of life, and with a stubborn streak that could drive anyone mad. I loved him fiercely, as any mother would, and watching him grow into his own had been one of my greatest joys. He was set to start college in the fall, eager to chase dreams I could barely keep up with. Then, one day, it all came to an abrupt, unimaginable halt. It was a car accident. A phone call in the middle of the night shattered the fragile bubble of our lives. I remember racing to the hospital, Edward, my late husband, driving in strained silence while my heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. When the doctor told us Daniel would never walk again, I barely understood the words. I clung to the hope that it was a mistake, that medical miracles could work wonders. But as the days turned into weeks, reality settled in. Paralyzed from the waist down. A spinal cord injury that left him bound to a wheelchair, his independence stripped away in the blink of an eye. The next 27 years were spent in the shadow of that moment. Edward passed away 5 years after Daniel's accident. His heart couldn't withstand the stress, the grief. I was left alone to care for my boy, to take on the role of nurse, caretaker, and mother, all while grieving the life I thought we'd have. There were days I wondered how I managed it. Daniel was difficult at times, though I couldn't blame him. He had lost so much, his future, his autonomy, and he often lashed out in frustration. But through it all, I reminded myself that he was still my son, the same boy who used to bring me dandelions from the yard and call me his best friend. I vowed to be there for him, no matter how heavy the burden became. Now I'm 70. My body is slower, weaker, but my mind remains sharp. Daniel still lives with me, confined to the small room we converted for his needs. It's equipped with everything he could possibly require, a hospital bed, a lift to transfer him in and out of his wheelchair, and shelves lined with books and gadgets he spends his days tinkering with. Over the years, we fell into a routine. I cooked, cleaned, helped him bathe and dress, and kept him company during the long, quiet hours. But lately, something hasn't felt right. It started a few months ago. Small things, easily dismissed at first. I'd leave his room to make tea and come back to find his chair slightly out of place. Or I'd hear faint noises coming from his room when I thought he was asleep, shuffling sounds, like someone moving. I told myself it was nothing. My mind was playing tricks on me. After all, Daniel couldn't move on his own. Could he? I didn't want to believe the thoughts creeping into my mind. They felt absurd, disloyal even, to question my son after all we had been through together. But the doubts wouldn't leave me. They grew louder, especially after the day I walked into his room unannounced and saw him quickly hiding something under his blanket. He looked startled, defensive, and when I asked him what he was doing, he brushed me off. "It's nothing, Mom. Just leave it," he said, his tone sharper than usual. But it wasn't nothing. I could feel it in my bones. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling and wrestling with my thoughts. What was I suspecting? That Daniel had been deceiving me for nearly 3 decades? The idea was preposterous. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up. Finally, after weeks of sleepless nights and second-guessing myself, I decided to act. It felt wrong, invasive even, but I couldn't ignore my instincts any longer. The next morning, I purchased a small hidden camera online. It arrived 2 days later, a sleek little device that could be tucked inconspicuously onto a shelf in his room. My hands trembled as I set it up, angling it to capture the bed, the wheelchair, and most of the room. I told myself it was for peace of mind. That it would put my doubts to rest once and for all. The first day passed uneventfully. I checked the footage that evening, feeling both guilty and relieved when I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Daniel spent most of the day in his chair, reading and occasionally calling for my help, just as he always did. The second day was the same. And the third. But on the fourth day, everything changed. That evening, as I reviewed the footage on my laptop, my heart stopped. The timestamp read 2:37 p.m. I had been out grocery shopping at the time. The video showed Daniel sitting in his wheelchair, staring at the door for a long moment. Then, to my utter disbelief, he shifted. His legs, paralyzed for 27 years, moved. He reached down, gripping the arms of the wheelchair, and pushed himself up. Up. Daniel stood, unsteady at first, but standing nonetheless. My breath caught as I watched him take a shaky step forward, then another, his hands gripping the back of the chair for support. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. My son, who I had bathed, fed, and cared for as though he were entirely helpless, was walking. The rest of the footage blurred together. My mind raced with questions, my chest tight with a storm of emotions I couldn't begin to unravel. Betrayal. Confusion. Anger. Relief. How long had he been doing this? How long had he been lying to me? And why? I closed the laptop, my hands trembling, and sat in silence for what felt like hours. The boy I had sacrificed so much for, the man who had been my sole purpose for decades, had kept a secret that shattered everything I thought I knew about our lives. I didn't know how I would confront him. But I knew I couldn't let it go. The morning after seeing the footage, I woke up with a pit in my stomach. My body felt heavy, as if the weight of what I had seen was pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I sat at the edge of my bed, staring at the worn carpet, trying to make sense of the betrayal. Daniel was walking. The words repeated in my mind, cycling through disbelief, anger, and sorrow. For 27 years, I had devoted my life to him. I'd given up my own freedom, my own dreams, to ensure his comfort and care. I hadn't questioned it for a second. Not once had I hesitated when he needed me. And now, all of that, the years, the sacrifices, felt like a lie. The house was quiet as I moved through the hallway, my slippers brushing softly against the floor. Daniel's door was closed, as it usually was in the mornings. I hesitated outside it, my hand hovering over the doorknob, unsure of what I would say if I entered. I had spent the night rehearsing conversations in my head, imagining everything from quiet questions to outright accusations. But nothing felt right. In the end, I turned away, retreating to the kitchen to make tea. The routine felt grounding, even if my hands trembled as I filled the kettle. The sound of water boiling, the clink of the spoon against the mug, it was something to hold on to, something normal in a world that suddenly didn't make sense. Daniel called for me mid-morning, as he often did when he needed help with something. His voice carried down the hallway, familiar and calm, as if nothing had changed. "Mom? Can you come here for a second?" I paused, the mug of tea still in my hand, and took a deep breath. "Just go," I told myself. "Act normal. Don't confront him yet." I wasn't ready, not until I understood more. When I entered his room, he was sitting in his wheelchair, as always. His hair was slightly disheveled, and a book rested open in his lap. He smiled when he saw me, the same smile that had once brought me so much comfort. "Can you grab me the other book from the shelf? The one about the war?" I nodded, forcing my feet to move toward the shelf. My hand shook as I reached for the book, my mind racing. How could he sit there so calmly, asking for books and pretending nothing was amiss, when I had seen him walking just hours ago? "Here," I said, handing him the book. My voice sounded strained, even to my own ears. "Thanks, Mom," he said, his attention already drifting back to his reading. I stood there for a moment, watching him. He didn't seem nervous or guilty, just normal. Like nothing was wrong. It made the knot in my chest tighten even more. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I busied myself with chores, but my mind was elsewhere, playing the footage over and over in my head. The image of Daniel standing, his hands gripping the wheelchair for balance, was burned into my memory. I tried to make sense of it, to come up with explanations that didn't involve deceit. Was it a miracle? A sudden recovery he hadn't told me about? But if that were true, why hide it? Why lie? By evening, the questions had grown unbearable. I sat in the living room with the hidden camera's footage playing on my laptop, the screen angled away from the hallway in case Daniel rolled in. The more I watched, the angrier I became. It wasn't just a moment of weakness or a single incident. The footage showed him standing and walking several times, always when he thought I was out of the house or asleep. Sometimes he stretched, pacing slowly across the room. Other times he sat back down quickly, as if afraid of being caught. It was deliberate. Intentional. And it hurt more than I could put into words. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling and wrestling with what to do. Should I confront him? Should I wait? Part of me wanted answers immediately, to demand an explanation for the years of deception. But another part of me was afraid of what he might say, of the truth that might break me even further. By morning, I had made my decision. I couldn't let this fester any longer. The betrayal was too deep, too consuming. I needed to hear it from him, no matter how much it hurt. After breakfast, I waited until Daniel had settled into his room for the day. I stood outside his door, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. My hand trembled as I knocked lightly. "Come in," he called. I pushed the door open, stepping inside with deliberate calm. He looked up from his book, his expression curious. "Is something wrong?" he asked. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, my arms crossed. For a moment, I couldn't find the words. My throat felt tight, my chest heavy with the weight of what I was about to say. "I need to talk to you, Daniel," I said finally, my voice steady but low. "And I need you to be honest with me." He frowned, setting the book aside. "Okay," he said slowly. "What's going on?" I took a deep breath, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. "I know," I said. "I know you can walk." His expression froze, the color draining from his face. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. "What are you talking about?" he said finally, his voice wavering. "I've seen you," I said, my voice breaking. "On camera. I put a hidden camera in your room, Daniel. I've watched you walk." His jaw tightened, his hands gripping the armrests of his wheelchair. You were spying on me," he said, his tone sharp. "You lied to me," I shot back, my voice rising. "For 27 years, Daniel. I've cared for you. I've given up everything for you. And now I find out it was all a lie?" His face twisted with a mix of anger and something else, guilt, maybe. He didn't respond, and the silence felt louder than any words could have. "Why?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Why would you do this to me?" Daniel looked away, his gaze fixed on the floor. For a long moment, he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "You wouldn't understand." Daniel's words, "you wouldn't understand," hung in the air, chilling and cryptic. I stared at him, my breath caught between disbelief and fury. For 27 years, I had been his caretaker, his lifeline. I had devoted my existence to him, and now he was sitting in front of me, acting as though I was the one who had done something wrong. "Make me understand," I said, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and desperation. "Because right now, all I see is someone who lied to me. Someone who let me believe they were helpless, while I gave up everything for them." Daniel didn't look at me. His gaze was fixed on the floor, his hands gripping the armrests of his wheelchair so tightly his knuckles turned white. "I didn't plan for it to happen like this," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "What does that even mean?" I asked, taking a step closer to him. My voice was louder now, sharper. "How long, Daniel? How long have you been able to walk?" He flinched slightly at my tone, but he didn't answer. "Answer me," I demanded. "How long?" Finally, he looked up, his eyes meeting mine. I saw something in them I hadn't expected, fear. Not just guilt or shame, but real fear, like a child caught in a terrible mistake. "For years," he said quietly. I felt the air leave my lungs as if I'd been punched. 4 years. For 4 years, he had been able to walk, and I hadn't known. He had kept it from me, let me continue to care for him as though nothing had changed. For years, I repeated, my voice hollow. You've been walking for 4 years, and you didn't tell me? I couldn't, he said, his tone defensive now. I didn't know how. Didn't know how? I laughed bitterly, the sound almost foreign to my own ears. You didn't know how to tell me you weren't paralyzed anymore? Daniel, do you have any idea what I've done for you? The things I've sacrificed, because I thought you needed me? I didn't ask you to do all that, he snapped suddenly, his voice rising for the first time. You chose this, Mom. You made me your whole world. I didn't ask for that. His words hit me harder than I thought possible. I took a step back, my chest tightening. You think I chose this? I whispered. You think I wanted to lose everything, to spend my life taking care of you because you couldn't? Do you think I wouldn't have given anything to see you walk again, to see you have your life back? He looked away, his jaw clenched, but I pressed on. The dam inside me had broken, and years of unspoken feelings spilled out like a flood. I didn't do this for me, Daniel. I did it because I love you. Because I'm your mother, and that's what mothers do. But now I don't even know who you are. The silence that followed was unbearable. I watched him, waiting for him to speak, to explain himself, but he seemed to be struggling with something deeper. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost pleading. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, he said. When I started walking again, I didn't know if it would last. The doctors always said there was a slim chance my nerves could heal, but it wasn't guaranteed. I was scared to tell you, scared that if I did, and then I lost it again, it would break you. Break me? I asked, my voice trembling. You thought lying to me for years would protect me? Daniel, you've already broken me. This is worse than anything else you could have done. His shoulders slumped, and I saw tears welling in his eyes. I didn't know how to stop, he admitted. The longer it went on, the harder it got to tell you. And then I realized that if I told you, everything would change. You'd stop caring for me. You'd leave. Leave? I repeated, stunned. Daniel, I'm your mother. I would never leave you. But you'd have your own life again, he said, his voice cracking. You'd move on, and I'd just be here. Alone. The depth of his fear struck me like a bolt of lightning. He hadn't kept this from me out of malice or selfishness, it was loneliness, the thought of being left behind, that had driven his deception. I sat down heavily in the chair across from him, my anger dimming but replaced by an ache I couldn't describe. Daniel, I said softly, my voice wavering. You've never been alone. And you never would have been, no matter what. I didn't know that, he said, tears streaming down his face now. I thought you needed me to need you. That if I told you the truth, you wouldn't want to take care of me anymore. And then I wouldn't have anyone. I stared at him, my heart breaking in ways I hadn't thought possible. For years, I had thought of him as the vulnerable one, the one who needed my care and protection. But now I realized that in his own way, he had been protecting me too, or trying to. His fear of losing me had driven him to a choice I could barely comprehend. I don't even know what to say, I admitted, my voice trembling. You kept this from me for so long. I don't know how to move forward from this. Neither do I, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry. For the first time in decades, Daniel and I sat in silence, the weight of the truth hanging heavily between us. There were no easy answers, no way to undo the years of deception or the pain it had caused. But beneath the anger and the hurt, I felt a flicker of something else, love. The bond that had tied us together all these years, even through lies and misunderstandings. It wasn't enough to fix everything. But maybe, just maybe, it was enough to start again. The days following Daniel's confession were some of the longest of my life. The air in the house felt different, tense, quiet, as though the walls themselves were bracing for what would come next. I had spent decades caring for him, structuring my everyday around his needs, and now that I knew the truth, I didn't know how to exist in this space with him. I wanted to scream, to cry, to demand more answers. But what would that accomplish? The betrayal was already laid bare, raw and painful. Now, we had to figure out how to live with it. I started small, testing the waters of this new reality. I didn't rush into his room every time he called for me. When he asked for something he could easily do himself, something I now knew he was capable of, I paused. "Do you really need me to do that?" I asked one morning after he asked me to retrieve a book from the shelf. He hesitated, his expression tense. "No," he said quietly. "I don't." For the first time in years, I watched him wheel himself over to the shelf, stand slowly, and take the book he wanted. I felt a mix of emotions, pride, sadness, anger, all tangled together in a knot I couldn't untie. Watching him move, seeing the independence he had hidden from me for so long, felt like glimpsing a stranger. As the days passed, Daniel seemed to retreat inward, his guilt manifesting in silence and avoidance. I didn't press him, though every time I passed his door, I wanted to barge in and demand he explain himself further. Instead, I waited, letting him come to me on his terms. It wasn't until a week later that he finally spoke. "Mom," he said one evening, his voice hesitant. "Can we talk?" I turned from the kitchen sink, drying my hands on a towel. "I think we should," I said, my tone measured. I gestured to the kitchen table, and we sat across from each other, the space between us feeling wider than it ever had. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his shirt. "About how I hurt you. About how I lied. And you're right. I did. I don't think I realized how much it would hurt you until you found out." His voice cracked slightly, and I saw the raw vulnerability in his eyes. For a moment, I felt my anger soften, replaced by the love I had always carried for him, even in my darkest moments. "Why, Daniel?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Why didn't you trust me enough to tell me? Was I really that blind to how you were feeling?" "It wasn't about trust," he said quickly. "It was about... I don't know. Fear, maybe. I thought if I told you, everything would change. And I didn't want things to change." I frowned, trying to make sense of his words. "Change how? What were you so afraid of?" He took a deep breath, his hands still fidgeting. "You've always been there for me, Mom. Always. After the accident, when Dad died, when everything fell apart, you were the one constant. I didn't want to lose that. I didn't want to lose you." "Daniel," I said, my voice softening. "You were never going to lose me. I'm your mother. Nothing could ever change that." "I know that now," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But back then, I didn't. And when I started walking again, it felt like I was losing the only thing that made me matter." I stared at him, my heart breaking all over again. "You thought being paralyzed was the only thing that made you matter to me?" I asked, my voice trembling. He nodded, tears streaming down his face. "You gave up so much for me, Mom. Your time, your freedom, your life. I thought if I didn't need you anymore, you'd realize how much you missed out on. And you'd leave." His words struck me like a thunderbolt. I had always seen myself as the selfless one, the caregiver, the one who held everything together. I had never stopped to consider how my devotion might have felt to him, suffocating, overwhelming, like a weight he couldn't shake. I had thought I was doing what was best for him, but maybe I hadn't been listening as closely as I should have. "Oh, Daniel," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I didn't realize. I didn't know you felt that way. I didn't know how to tell you," he said. And then it just got harder and harder to say anything. We sat in silence for a long time, the weight of his words settling over us. I reached across the table and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm not going anywhere," I said firmly. "But we can't keep living like this. You can't keep pretending, and I can't keep holding on to the past. We need to move forward. Together. He nodded, his grip tightening on my hand. I want that too, Mom. I don't know how to start. Neither do I admitted. But maybe we can figure it out. The next day, I made small changes to our routine. I encouraged Daniel to do more for himself, to take ownership of his independence. At first, he was hesitant, but as the days turned into weeks, I began to see a transformation. He started taking walks outside, cooking simple meals, and even helping me with chores around the house. It wasn't easy. There were moments when I felt a pang of sadness, wondering how different our lives could have been if he had told me the truth earlier. But there were also moments of joy, of pride, as I watched him rediscover his own strength. One evening, as we sat on the porch together, Daniel turned to me, his expression earnest. "Thank you," he said. "For everything. For not giving up on me. Even when I didn't deserve it." I smiled, my heart swelling with love. "You'll always deserve it," I said. "You're my son, Daniel. And that will never change." The days stretched into weeks as Daniel and I settled into a new rhythm. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the weight of what he had done crept back into my mind, stirring old hurt. But each time I saw him take a step toward independence, a small part of that hurt faded. It was a fragile balance, a push and pull of emotions I was still learning to navigate. For Daniel, the changes were visible. He walked more freely now, though always with an air of caution. At first, he avoided my gaze when he stood, as though he expected judgment in my eyes. But gradually, he began to trust that I wasn't angry anymore. At least, not in the same way. One morning, as I sat at the kitchen table sipping tea, Daniel walked in carrying a small stack of plates. I watched him set them on the counter, his movements slow but deliberate. It was such a simple act, but for years, it had been one I had always done for him. "You're getting better at that," I said, smiling softly. He turned, his expression a mixture of pride and guilt. "Thanks," he said. "I'm trying." I nodded, sipping my tea. "I can see that." He hesitated for a moment, then sat across from me, his hands folded on the table. "Mom," he began, his voice uncertain. "I've been thinking a lot about everything. About us." I set my mug down, sensing the weight of his words. "What about us?" He looked down at his hands, fidgeting slightly. "I know I hurt you. And I know I can't just fix that overnight. But I want to make it better. I want to make things right." His sincerity struck me, and I felt a pang of both love and sadness. "Daniel," I said gently, "making things right isn't about fixing the past. It's about what we do now. About being honest with each other, no matter how hard it is." He nodded, his eyes glistening. "I know. And I want to be honest. I don't always know how." "You're doing it now," I said, reaching across the table to place my hand over his. "And that's a start." As the weeks went on, Daniel and I began to talk more openly. He shared the fear that had driven his deception, the fear of being abandoned, of losing the connection we had built over the years. It was painful to hear, knowing that my devotion had felt like a burden to him at times. But it was also freeing. For the first time in years, we were truly talking, not just existing in the roles we had built around his paralysis. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Daniel spoke of the accident. He rarely mentioned it, and I had long stopped pressing him for details. But now, he seemed ready to confront the memories that had shaped so much of his life. "I was so stupid," he said, his voice low. "I shouldn't have been driving that night. I knew better." "Daniel," I said softly, "it was an accident. You've carried that guilt for so long, but it wasn't your fault." He shook his head, his jaw tight. "Maybe not. But I've spent all these years making you pay for it, Mom. That's what I can't forgive myself for." I reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "You're not making me pay for anything," I said. "You're my son. I chose to be here for you because I love you, not because I felt I had to. That doesn't change, no matter what. He nodded, though tears slipped down his cheeks. I don't deserve you, he whispered. Yes, you do, I said firmly. You always have. The conversations we had on the porch became a nightly ritual, a time for us to unpack years of unspoken feelings and build something new. Daniel opened up about his hopes for the future, hopes he had kept hidden for fear they would seem foolish. He wanted to work again, to find a way to contribute, to feel like he had a purpose beyond his wheelchair. I encouraged him, though the thought of him leaving the house, of living a life outside of my care, filled me with a bittersweet ache. I wanted him to be happy, to thrive. But letting go, even just a little, wasn't easy. One afternoon, Daniel surprised me by announcing that he had applied for a part-time job at the local library. I figured it's a good place to start, he said, his tone casual, though I could see the nervousness in his eyes. That's wonderful, Daniel, I said, beaming. I'm so proud of you. His face lit up at my words, and I felt a warmth I hadn't experienced in years. This was what I had always wanted for him, not just independence, but a sense of fulfillment, of knowing he was capable of so much more than he had allowed himself to believe. The library job became a turning point for both of us. Daniel thrived there, his confidence growing with each passing day. And for me, it was a chance to step back, to begin reclaiming pieces of my own life. I started taking long walks in the mornings, visiting friends I hadn't seen in years, and even signing up for a painting class at the community center. For the first time in decades, I felt like more than just a caretaker. One evening, as we sat on the porch together, I turned to Daniel with a question that had been on my mind for weeks. Do you think we can really move past this? I asked. Do you think we can rebuild what we've lost? He looked at me, his expression thoughtful. I think we already are, he said. It's not perfect, and it's not easy. But we're trying. And that's enough for me. I nodded, a tear slipping down my cheek. It's enough for me too. As the sun set, casting the porch in a warm, golden glow, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. Daniel and I had been through so much, hurt, anger, betrayal, but we were finding our way back to each other. Slowly, cautiously, but with love guiding every step. And for the first time in a long time, I believed we could heal. The weeks that followed were a mixture of hope and adjustment as Daniel and I continued to navigate the uncharted territory of our new relationship. His job at the library had become a source of pride for him and for me. Each evening, he would come home with stories of the people he had met, the books he had shelved, and the small victories that made him feel alive again. It's just part-time, he would say, almost bashfully. But it's something. It's more than something, Daniel, I would reply, smiling. It's a start. For me, the transition was more complicated. Letting go of the routines I had built around Daniel's care wasn't easy. I had spent so many years defining myself as his caretaker that I struggled to figure out who I was without that role. My mornings were freer now, my days less structured, but the quiet was unsettling. I began to fill the time with small acts of self-discovery. I joined a knitting circle at the community center, something I had always wanted to do but never felt I had time for. I started taking my tea on the porch, listening to the birds and letting the stillness of the early hours calm my thoughts. Slowly, I began to remember the parts of myself that had been buried under years of caregiving. One day, as I was folding laundry, Daniel came into the room carrying a piece of paper. He looked nervous, his eyes darting between me and the paper in his hands. Mom, he said, clearing his throat. I need to talk to you about something. I set the laundry down, immediately on edge. What is it? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He held out the paper, and I took it, my hands trembling slightly. It was a lease agreement for a small apartment downtown. I've been thinking, he said quickly, as if afraid of my reaction. It's time for me to move out. I've been saving from the job, and this place is affordable. I think I'm ready. I stared at the paper, a knot forming in my chest. I had always known this day would come, had hoped for it, even, but now that it was here, I wasn't sure how to feel. Pride? Sadness? Fear? All of it swirled together, making it hard to speak. "You're ready?" I said finally, my voice soft. He nodded. "I think so. I mean, I'm scared, but I need to do this, Mom. For me. And for you." "For me?" I asked, frowning. He sat down across from me, his expression earnest. "You've given me so much. Too much, maybe. You need your own life, Mom. Your own freedom. I've been holding you back for years." His words broke something inside me. I reached across the table, taking his hands in mine. "Daniel," I said, my voice trembling, "you've never held me back. I chose this life because I love you, because you're my son. But if you're ready for this step, then I'm ready too." He smiled, tears welling in his eyes. "I'll still visit," he said quickly. "And you can come by anytime. It's not like I'm leaving for good." "I know," I said, though the ache in my chest remained. Over the next few weeks, we worked together to prepare for his move. We packed his belongings, sorted through years of memories, and visited the apartment to measure for furniture. Each task felt bittersweet, a reminder of the life we had shared and the new chapter we were stepping into. On moving day, as we stood in his new living room, surrounded by boxes, I felt a surge of pride. Daniel had come so far, from the boy who had hidden his recovery out of fear to the man standing before me, ready to embrace his independence. "You did it," I said, smiling through tears. "We did it," he replied, pulling me into a hug. The first few weeks after Daniel moved out were an adjustment for both of us. The house felt emptier than I had anticipated, and I found myself missing the sound of his voice, the clatter of his wheelchair, even the calls for help that had once been so routine. But I also felt something else, freedom. For the first time in years, I didn't have to plan my days around someone else's needs. I could focus on myself, on the things I had let fall to the wayside. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. Daniel visited often, usually bringing stories from his job or updates on his apartment. Each time he walked through the door, I felt a rush of pride, knowing how far he had come. He had started taking evening classes at the local college, pursuing a degree in library science, a dream he had buried for years. "I want to make this my career," he said one evening over dinner. "It feels right, you know?" "It's perfect," I said, my heart swelling. "I'm so proud of you, Daniel." "Thanks, Mom," he said, his voice soft. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." Our relationship continued to grow, built on a foundation of honesty and trust that we had worked so hard to rebuild. We still had our moments, times when old wounds resurfaced or when the weight of the past felt too heavy, but we faced them together. One evening, as we sat on the porch during one of his visits, Daniel turned to me with a question that caught me off guard. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "All those years you spent taking care of me?" I thought for a moment, the question settling in my mind. "No," I said finally. "I don't regret loving you, Daniel. I don't regret being there for you. But I do wish I had listened more, that I had seen what you needed beyond the care." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I wish I had been honest sooner. But I'm glad we're here now." "So am I said, smiling. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the porch in a warm, golden glow, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. Daniel had found his path, and I was beginning to find mine. The road hadn't been easy, but it had brought us to this moment, a moment of love, resilience, and hope for the future. And for the first time, I truly believed we could face whatever came next, together. The weeks that followed Daniel's move were strange, but filled with a quiet sort of growth. The house felt emptier than I was used to, the silence a constant reminder of the shift in our lives. For years, the rhythms of my day had revolved around him, his meals, his routines, his needs. Now, I had all this time, and for the first time in decades, I wasn't sure what to do with it. It was both freeing and unnerving. One morning, as I sat at the kitchen table sipping my tea, I noticed the stack of flyers I had picked up at the community center weeks ago. They were for workshops and activities, things I had once dismissed as indulgent luxuries. But now, with time on my hands, they felt like possibilities. I thumbed through them, pausing on one for a beginner's painting class. The image of a brush sweeping across a canvas stirred something in me, a longing I hadn't felt in years. That evening, I signed up. The first class was intimidating. The other attendees were younger, more confident, their canvases already coming to life while I stared at the blank space in front of me. But as the instructor guided us through the basics, I found myself letting go of the self-doubt. Each stroke of the brush felt like a small act of reclaiming something I had lost. By the end of the class, I had created something messy but mine, and for the first time in years, I felt a flicker of pride in something outside of caregiving. Meanwhile, Daniel was flourishing in his own way. He called often, sharing updates about his classes and his job. Each time I heard his voice, it was filled with a confidence that had been missing for so long. "I helped a kid find a book on space today," he said one evening. He was so excited about it. It reminded me of when I was little and used to go on about astronomy. "You were obsessed," I said, laughing. "I still have your glow-in-the-dark star stickers in your old room." "You should bring them over," he said, his voice light. "Maybe I'll put them in the apartment." The casual way he mentioned his apartment made me smile. He was settling in, building a life for himself, and I couldn't have been prouder. But there were still challenges. The wounds of the past didn't disappear overnight, and every now and then, they surfaced in ways that caught us both off guard. One evening, during one of his visits, I made a passing comment about how I used to wheel him around the garden. It was meant to be nostalgic, but I saw his face tighten. "I hated that," he said quietly. I blinked, surprised. "Hated what?" "Being wheeled around like I couldn't do anything for myself," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I know you were trying to help, but it made me feel helpless. Like I wasn't a person anymore." His words stung, but I forced myself to listen. "I didn't know you felt that way," I said softly. "I didn't know how to tell you," he admitted. "But it's something I've been thinking about a lot lately. How much I let myself stay in that mindset because it was easier than trying to push back." His honesty was a gift, even if it was hard to hear. It reminded me of how much I had missed in those years, how much I had assumed without asking. "I'm sorry, Daniel," I said, reaching for his hand. "I never meant to make you feel that way. I didn't know what else to do." "I know," he said, squeezing my hand. "And I don't blame you, Mom. I'm just trying to make sense of it all now." These conversations became part of our new rhythm, unpacking the past while embracing the present. It wasn't always easy, but it felt necessary, like clearing out old cobwebs to make room for something brighter. One weekend, Daniel invited me to see his apartment. I hadn't been there since moving day, and I was curious to see how he had made it his own. When I arrived, I was struck by how much it reflected him. The bookshelves were packed with titles on every subject imaginable, the walls adorned with simple but thoughtful decorations. On his desk sat a small telescope, a nod to the dreams he had once buried. "It's lovely," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "You've made it a home." "Thanks, Mom," he said, smiling. "It feels good. Like a fresh start." We spent the afternoon talking and laughing, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was getting to know him as a person, not just as my son. He showed me the dishes he had picked out, the recipes he was trying, even the small herb garden he had started on the balcony. Each detail felt like a testament to his growth, to the man he was becoming. As I left that evening, I felt a deep sense of peace. Daniel was thriving, and so was I. We were both learning to live in a world where our lives weren't defined by his paralysis or by the lies that had once kept us trapped. The weeks turned into months, and life continued to unfold in unexpected ways. My painting classes became a cherished routine, a space where I could explore my creativity and connect with others. Daniel's confidence grew with each passing day, his world expanding as he embraced new opportunities. One evening, as we sat on the porch during one of his visits, I turned to him with a question that had been on my mind. "Do you ever think about the accident?" I asked. "About how different things might have been?" He was quiet for a moment, staring at the horizon. "I used to," he said. "All the time. I used to think about what I lost, what I could have been. But now, I don't know. I think I'm starting to see what I've gained instead." His words stayed with me long after he left that night. Life hadn't turned out the way either of us had expected, but maybe that was okay. Maybe the beauty of it was in the resilience, in the ways we had found to rebuild and grow, despite everything. As I sat on the porch, the stars twinkling above, I felt a deep gratitude for Daniel, for our journey, and for the new horizons we were both discovering. The next chapter of our lives felt like uncharted territory, new and uncertain, but also filled with promise. Daniel was thriving in ways I hadn't imagined possible, and I was beginning to see the outlines of a life for myself beyond the role I had played for so long. It wasn't perfect, we both had moments when the past crept in, but we were learning to navigate them together. One day, Daniel called me from the library. His voice was filled with excitement, a tone I hadn't heard in years. "Mom, guess what?" he said, barely able to contain himself. "I've been promoted. They want me to be the assistant coordinator for the children's programs." "That's wonderful, Daniel," I said, beaming. "I'm so proud of you." "Thanks," he said, his voice softening. "I didn't think they'd notice me like that. It feels good, you know?" "You've earned it," I said. "They'd be foolish not to notice someone as hardworking as you." His promotion marked a turning point, not just for him, but for me as well. It was a reminder that we were both capable of more than we had believed. He threw himself into his new role, organizing storytime sessions, craft activities, and even a weekend science club. He would call me in the evenings, recounting the day's successes and challenges with a spark in his voice that filled me with joy. For my part, I began to push myself out of my comfort zone. The painting classes I had joined became more than just a hobby, they became a way for me to connect with others and explore parts of myself I had long ignored. I started submitting my work to local art shows, a small but meaningful step toward reclaiming my independence. One afternoon, as Daniel and I sat on the porch, he turned to me with an expression of quiet curiosity. "Mom," he said, "what do you want now?" "For yourself, I mean." The question caught me off guard. For so many years, my wants and needs had been secondary, almost non-existent. I hadn't allowed myself to dream beyond the confines of our shared reality. "I'm not sure," I admitted. "I think I'm still figuring that out." "Well," he said, smiling, "whatever it is, I think you should go for it. You deserve to be happy." His words lingered with me, sparking a quiet determination. I began to think more about what I wanted, what my life could look like now that I wasn't bound by the routines and responsibilities that had defined me for so long. The answer wasn't immediate, but it came in small moments, the joy of finishing a painting, the warmth of a new friendship, the quiet satisfaction of sitting in the garden with a book. Each moment felt like a piece of a puzzle I was slowly putting together. Daniel's journey was unfolding too, though not without challenges. As he embraced his independence, he occasionally stumbled, moments of doubt, of fear that he wasn't enough. He called me one evening, his voice heavy with frustration. "I messed up at work today," he said. "I forgot to schedule the volunteers for the weekend, and now we're scrambling." "It's okay to make mistakes, Daniel," I said. "That's part of learning." "I know," he said, sighing. I want to prove I can do this. That I'm not just some guy who used to need everyone's help." "You've already proved that," I said gently. "You're more than enough, Daniel. And everyone around you can see it." The conversation reminded me of how far we had both come, but also of how much work was still ahead. Healing wasn't linear, it came in waves, some gentle, others crashing. But through it all, we had each other, and that made all the difference. One weekend, Daniel invited me to the library for a special event he had organized, a universe day for kids, complete with telescopes, craft stations, and a presentation on astronomy. As I walked through the library, watching him interact with the children and their families, I felt an overwhelming sense of pride. "Look at him go," one of his coworkers said, smiling. "He's a natural with the kids." "He always has been," I said, my heart swelling. At the end of the event, Daniel came over, his face flushed with excitement. "What did you think?" he asked. "It was incredible," I said. "You found your place, Daniel." His smile faltered slightly, and he looked down at his hands. "I couldn't have done any of this without you," he said softly. "You've been my rock, Mom. Even when I didn't deserve it." "You've always deserved it," I said, pulling him into a hug. "And now you're building something amazing. I couldn't be prouder." As the months passed, our relationship continued to grow. We found new ways to support each other, to celebrate the victories and weather the challenges. Daniel was thriving in his independence, and I was discovering the freedom to embrace my own passions. It wasn't always easy, but it was ours, a life rebuilt on trust, love, and resilience. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the stars, Daniel turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think Dad would be proud of us?" he asked. I felt a lump rise in my throat. "I think he'd be more than proud," I said. "I think he'd be amazed." In that quiet moment, under the vast expanse of the night sky, I felt the weight of the past begin to lift. We had come so far, through pain, through betrayal, through uncertainty, and we had emerged stronger for it. Our journey wasn't over, but for the first time in years, I felt ready to embrace whatever came next. And as Daniel leaned back in his chair, pointing out constellations he remembered from his childhood, I felt a deep and abiding sense of gratitude. For him. For us. For the life we were building together. Life was settling into a rhythm, not the kind I'd known for the past 27 years, but a new one, built on the foundations Daniel and I were laying together. Each day brought fresh milestones, some large, others seemingly small, but all significant in their way. For the first time in decades, I felt like we were both learning what it meant to truly live. Daniel had thrown himself into his work at the library, his passion for helping others shining through in every conversation we had. One evening, he called me, his voice buzzing with excitement. "Mom, guess what?" he said, practically shouting. "What is it?" I asked, laughing at his enthusiasm. "They want me to give a talk. At the community center. It's part of a series on resilience and finding your path. They said my story could inspire people." I froze for a moment, a mixture of pride and nerves swelling in my chest. "Daniel, that's incredible," I said. "You'll be amazing." "You really think so?" he asked, his voice quieter now, tinged with uncertainty. "I know so," I said firmly. "You have so much to share. And if anyone can inspire others, it's you." The weeks leading up to his talk were filled with preparation. He practiced in front of me, stumbling over his words at first, but growing more confident with each attempt. Watching him speak about his journey, about the accident, his recovery, and even the mistakes he had made, brought tears to my eyes. He was so open, so honest, and I couldn't have been prouder. The day of the talk, the room was packed. I sat in the front row, my hands clasped tightly in my lap as Daniel stepped onto the stage. He looked nervous at first, but as he began to speak, his voice steady and clear, I saw the man he had become, a man who had faced his fears and come out stronger. "Resilience isn't about never falling down," he said, his gaze sweeping across the room. "It's about getting back up, even when you're scared. And sometimes, it's about letting others help you stand until you're ready to do it on your own." When he finished, the applause was thunderous. I stood, clapping until my hands hurt, my heart swelling with pride. As Daniel stepped off the stage, he came straight to me, his smile radiant. "How'd I do?" he asked, his voice still trembling with adrenaline. "You were perfect," I said, pulling him into a hug. "Absolutely perfect. That night, as we sat on the porch, Daniel turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking about Dad," he said. "About how much I wish he could see us now." "I think about him too," I admitted. "Every day. He would have been so proud of you, Daniel. Of everything you've accomplished." "I hope so," he said softly. "I've spent so much time feeling like I let him down. Like I let both of you down." "You never let us down," I said firmly. "You've always been enough, Daniel. And now, you're showing the world what I've always known, you're strong, kind, and capable of so much." He smiled, a flicker of relief crossing his face. "Thanks, Mom. That means everything to me." As Daniel flourished in his new role, I continued to explore my own path. The painting classes had become a source of joy and connection, and I even sold a few pieces at a local art fair. Each brushstroke felt like a reclamation of something I had lost, a reminder that it was never too late to discover new passions. One evening, as I worked on a new piece, Daniel called me with an idea. "Mom," he said, his voice filled with excitement. "We should do something together." "Together?" I asked, setting down my brush. "Like what?" "A joint project," he said. "You could paint, and I could write something to go with it. We could tell our story, about resilience, about family. What do you think?" The idea took root immediately, and over the next few weeks, we began working on the project. Daniel wrote essays and reflections, while I painted scenes inspired by our journey. It was a deeply personal collaboration, one that brought us even closer as we revisited the moments that had shaped us. When we finished, we shared the collection with friends and family at a small gathering. The response was overwhelming: tears, laughter, and heartfelt conversations about the importance of love, forgiveness, and growth. "This is just the beginning," Daniel said as we packed up that evening. "I think we could do more with this. Reach more people." "I'd like that," I said, smiling. "I'd like that a lot." As the months passed, our project evolved into a series of workshops and community events. We shared our story with others, listening as they shared theirs in return. Each connection felt like a reminder of how far we had come and how much we still had to give. One evening, as we wrapped up a workshop, Daniel turned to me with a wistful expression. "Do you ever think about the years we lost?" he asked. I thought for a moment, then shook my head. "Not anymore," I said. "I think about what we've gained instead. And that's more than enough. Our journey wasn't perfect, but it was ours. We had faced pain, betrayal, and uncertainty, but we had come out stronger, more connected, and more hopeful than ever. Together, we were building a life filled with purpose and love, one milestone at a time." As I sat on the porch that night, the stars twinkling above, I felt a profound sense of gratitude, for Daniel, for our journey, and for the future we were creating together. The road ahead was still unknown, but for the first time I felt ready to embrace it, knowing we would face it side by side. The idea that our story could help others had taken hold, becoming more than just a passing thought. Daniel and I began to see our journey as something larger, a way to inspire, to connect, to show others that healing and growth were possible even after years of pain. It was a strange feeling, stepping into this new role as storytellers, but it felt right. Our workshops grew in popularity, drawing people from all walks of life. They came to listen, to share, to find solace in knowing they weren't alone. Some spoke of their struggles with family, others of their battles with illness, and many simply came to hear the message that had become our mantra: resilience isn't about never falling, it's about choosing to rise again. One evening, after a particularly emotional session, Daniel and I sat together in the quiet of the empty room. He leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing on his lips. "Did you ever think we'd end up here?" he asked, his voice soft. "Not in a million years," I admitted, laughing lightly. "But I'm glad we did. It feels purposeful." He nodded, his gaze distant. "I used to think my purpose was gone after the accident. Like I was just existing, not really living. But now I feel like I'm finally doing something that matters. The workshops led to opportunities we hadn't anticipated, speaking engagements, interviews, even the beginnings of a book. Daniel and I worked together to write our story, weaving our perspectives into a narrative that captured both the pain and the hope of our journey. It was cathartic, revisiting those moments with fresh eyes, but it also brought challenges. There were things we hadn't spoken about, truths we hadn't fully explored. One evening, as we sat at the kitchen table editing a chapter, Daniel paused, his pen hovering over the page. "Mom," he said hesitantly, "there's something I haven't told you. About the accident." I set my pen down, my heart tightening. "What is it?" He took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly. "I wasn't just driving that night. I was angry. At you, at Dad, at everything. I wasn't paying attention because I was too busy stewing in my own head. That's why it happened." His words hit me like a wave, the weight of his guilt spilling over the table. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. I had carried my own guilt for years, wondering if I could have done something to prevent the accident, if I had failed him in some way. "Daniel," I said softly, reaching for his hand. "It was an accident. A terrible, tragic accident. But that doesn't make it your fault." He shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "I've spent so long hating myself for it, Mom. For everything I put you through. I don't know how to let it go." I squeezed his hand tightly, my own tears falling. "We can't change the past," I said. "But we can forgive ourselves. And each other. That's the only way to move forward." Writing the book became a process of healing for both of us. We laid bare the truths we had kept hidden, not just for others, but for ourselves. When it was finished, holding the first printed copy in my hands felt like holding a piece of our journey, tangible, real, and filled with love. We called it Resilient together. The book's release brought a whirlwind of attention. Daniel and I traveled to promote it, sharing our story with audiences who embraced us with open hearts. Each event was a reminder of the power of connection, of the way our pain and triumphs could resonate with others. But through it all, we never lost sight of what mattered most, the bond we had rebuilt, the life we were continuing to create. One evening, after a long day of travel, Daniel and I sat together in a quiet hotel room, sipping tea and reflecting on everything that had brought us here. "I never thought we'd get to this point," he said, his voice thoughtful. "I used to think our story was just messy. Too broken to mean anything." "Every story is messy," I said, smiling. "But that's what makes it worth telling." He nodded, his expression softening. "Do you think Dad would be proud?" I placed my hand on his. "I think he'd be amazed, Daniel. At how far we've come, and at the man you've become." As the months turned into years, Daniel and I continued to grow in our separate but connected lives. He expanded his role at the library, taking on new challenges with the confidence I always knew he had. I found joy in painting, in community, in the small but meaningful moments that filled my days. We didn't need to be together every moment anymore, but our bond remained as strong as ever. Each visit, each phone call, was a reminder of the love that had carried us through the hardest times. One afternoon, as we walked through the park together, Daniel turned to me with a smile. "You know," he said, "I used to think my life ended the day of the accident. But now I see it was just a beginning. A messy, painful beginning, but a beginning all the same." I smiled, my heart full. "And look at where you've taken it. Look at what we've built." He nodded, his gaze sweeping over the trees and the sky. "I wouldn't change any of it," he said. "Not now. Not after everything we've learned." In that moment, I felt a profound sense of peace. Our story wasn't perfect, but it was ours, a testament to the power of love, resilience, and the strength it takes to forgive and move forward. As we continued our walk, the future felt wide open, filled with possibilities we hadn't yet imagined. And I knew, no matter what came next, we would face it together. If you've enjoyed my story, please leave your comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel, where your support means the world to me. I look forward to bringing you more stories that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.